My name is Ahmed Khan. I'm 35 years old, and if someone had asked me a few years ago what the strongest bond in the world was, I would have answered without hesitation, the bond between parents and their children. I believed everything else could change. People could change. Circumstances could change. The world itself could change. But I never believed parents could betray their own child. Unfortunately, I learned far too late that greed can sometimes be stronger than blood. I worked for an international software company in Dubai. After years of working long hours and saving every extra dollar I could, I finally had enough money to buy a beautiful beach house near Karachi. It wasn't just a house built with concrete and bricks. It was my dream. Every window, every wall, every tree in the yard represented years of sacrifice and hard work. My parents and my younger brother visited the house often. At first, I thought they were genuinely happy for me. But little by little, their conversations started to change. Ahmed, my father would often say, "You spend most of your time overseas. What good is this house to you?" My mother would quickly add, "If the house were in your brother's name, the whole family could enjoy it together." I always smiled and answered politely, "Mom, I worked my whole life for this place. Whenever I come back to Pakistan, this is where I find peace." They never argued after that. But I could clearly see the disappointment hidden in their eyes. Around that time, my company assigned me to another major project in Dubai that would keep me there for 3 months. Before leaving, I checked every security system in the house, activated the smart locks, connected all the security cameras to cloud storage, locked everything up, and boarded my flight with complete peace of mind. The first 2 weeks went by normally. Work kept me so busy that I barely noticed whether it was day or night. Then one morning, just after I arrived at my office, I received a WhatsApp message from an unknown number. There was only one photo. A photo of my house. Standing in front of the front door was a smiling family I had never seen before. The caption read, "Beautiful home. We're moving in today." My hands immediately began to shake. At first, I assumed someone had simply sent the picture to the wrong number. But then I looked closer. I recognized every single detail. The white exterior walls, the blue front gate, even the coconut tree I had planted with my own hands. There was no mistake. It was my house. I immediately called the Pakistani phone number that had sent the photo. No one answered. While I was still trying to make sense of it all, another notification appeared on my phone. This time it was from my bank. "The ownership transfer of your property has been successfully completed." My heart nearly stopped. I logged into the online property registry immediately. My name was gone. Someone else's name had officially replaced mine as the owner. I stared at the screen in complete disbelief. There had to be some mistake. I immediately called the property registry office. The officer pulled up the file and calmly said, "Sir, everything was completed legally. You personally came into our office, submitted your identification documents, signed the transfer papers, and approved the sale." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I quietly replied, "The day you're talking about. I wasn't even in Pakistan. I was in Dubai. I have my passport, immigration records, and my company's attendance logs to prove exactly where I was." Silence filled the other end of the line. The officer's confident tone disappeared. Finally, he spoke again. "Sir, if that's true, then this is a very serious case." I ended the call and immediately contacted my attorney, Adnan Siddiqui. After listening carefully to everything, he said only one sentence. "Ahmed, forget emotions. From this point on, we deal only with evidence. If someone forged your signature, they won't get away with it for long." That same evening, we contacted the security company that managed my surveillance system. Fortunately, every camera was backed up to cloud storage. If the truth existed anywhere, it was there. The following afternoon, the footage arrived. As soon as the video started playing, I felt my stomach drop. The first person who appeared on the screen was my father. A few seconds later, my mother walked in beside him. Then my younger brother. The three of them were giving a real estate agent a tour of my house. A little later, a potential buyer arrived with his family. I watched in complete silence as my father smiled confidently and said, "Don't worry. My son lives overseas. He's given us full authority to handle everything." All the paperwork is already prepared. I grabbed the back of my chair, so tightly my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just a lie. It was the complete betrayal of my trust. My attorney paused the video and slowly turned toward me. Ahmed, we already have enough evidence to begin building the case. He paused for a moment before continuing. But I have a feeling this story is much bigger than just a stolen house. At that moment, I had no idea that over the next few days, a secret would come to light that would completely change everything I thought I knew about my family. The next morning, I didn't waste a single minute. Even though I was still in Dubai, I immediately granted my attorney Adnan Siddiqui a special power of attorney so he could begin legal action on my behalf without delay. The first thing he did was send legal notices to the Property Registry Office, my bank, and the Anti-Fraud Unit, requesting that every related document and record be preserved before anyone had a chance to destroy the evidence. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Adnan. Ahmed, he said, I have one piece of good news and one piece of bad news. I swallowed hard. Tell me the bad news first. He took a deep breath. The buyer paid the full purchase price for your house. It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. And the good news? The money never reached your bank account. I frowned. Then where did it go? That's exactly what we're about to find out. One question kept running through my mind. If the house had supposedly been sold in my name, why hadn't the money been deposited into my account? The following day, Adnan obtained a court order allowing him to access the banking records. By that evening, another bombshell had surfaced. Every dollar from the sale of my house had been transferred into a brand new bank account that had been opened just 2 weeks earlier. The account was under my name, but the photo wasn't mine. The national ID number was mine. The signature was forged. And the photograph belonged to my younger brother. For several minutes, I couldn't say a word. This wasn't just property theft anymore. Someone had created an entirely fake identity in my name and opened a fraudulent bank account. Adnan looked at me and said, "This is no longer just a civil dispute. We're dealing with identity theft, forgery, financial fraud, and organized criminal activity." That same evening, the bank security manager informed us that the surveillance footage from the day the account was opened had been preserved. We immediately reviewed the video. I stared at the screen. The first person to walk into the bank was my younger brother. A few seconds later, my father walked in. Together, they headed straight into a bank officer's office. About 40 minutes later, they walked back out. My brother was carrying a folder. There was a triumphant smile on his face. Adnan paused the footage. Now we know who planned this. He leaned back in his chair. But we still have to prove who inside the bank helped them pull it off. Over the next several hours, he requested copies of every application, signature card, account opening form, and supporting document from the bank. 2 days later, the preliminary forensic report arrived. It confirmed our worst fears. Every signature on the property transfer documents, the banking paperwork, and the identification records had been expertly forged. Whoever had done it wasn't an amateur. This was the work of someone experienced in document fraud. Then another surprising development came to light. The man who had purchased my house had been scammed too. He had genuinely believed the sale was completely legal. My father had introduced himself as my authorized representative and convinced him that I had given the family full authority to handle the transaction while I was overseas. When my attorney met with the buyer, the man was devastated. He immediately agreed to cooperate with the investigation. He handed over every payment receipt, every contract, every email, and every text message he'd exchanged during the purchase. One by one, the evidence was piling up in our favor. But the story was far from over. That night, around 11 o'clock, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I answered. An elderly man's voice came through the speaker. "Son, I can't talk for long." I stayed silent, listening carefully. He lowered his voice. "It's not just your father and your brother. There was another member of your family involved. None of this could have happened without him." My heart began pounding. "Who?" There was a long pause. Then he spoke just one name. "Your uncle." Before I could ask another question, the call disconnected. I sat there staring at my phone. The man I had trusted more than anyone else in the family after my father Could he really have been part of this conspiracy too? At that moment, only the investigation could give me the answer. I didn't sleep at all that night. The same words kept echoing in my mind over and over again. Your uncle. I couldn't believe it. My uncle, Salim, had always been known as the calm, reasonable one in the family. Whenever my father got angry with me, he was the one who defended me. When I started my business years earlier, he was the one who encouraged me not to give up. Had all of that been an act? The next morning, Adnan called me. Ahmed, I've uncovered some information about your uncle. What did you find? Over the past 2 months, he's visited the property registry office 3 different times. And every single time your father was with him. My heart started racing. But why were they going there? That's exactly what we're trying to determine. We've requested the visitor logs and all related documents. By noon, another major development surfaced. A registry office employee had secretly given a statement to the police. According to him, my uncle was the one preparing all of the paperwork. Every time he told the staff the same story. Ahmed is overseas, so his father has full authority to handle everything on his behalf. A wave of anger rushed through me. The man I had trusted my entire life had apparently been helping plan the betrayal. Adnan tried to calm me down. Save your anger for later. Right now, we need evidence. That evening, the complete forensic report finally arrived. It wasn't just the signatures that had been forged. The copy of my national ID had been altered. The photograph had been replaced. Several official government stamps had been counterfeited. The conclusion was obvious. This wasn't the work of one person. It had been a carefully planned operation. The following morning, police executed search warrants at the property registry office, the bank, and the real estate agency involved in the sale. They seized every relevant record. At first, the real estate agent claimed he knew nothing about the fraud. But once investigators showed him the surveillance footage, his story quickly changed. He admitted that my father had told him I had permanently relocated to Dubai and had personally decided to sell the house. He also confessed that every legal document had been prepared and delivered by my uncle. The picture was finally coming together. That same evening, police summoned my father, my younger brother, and my uncle for questioning. All 3 gave exactly the same statement. We're innocent. But once investigators placed the bank surveillance footage, the registry records, the forensic report, and the buyer's testimony in front of them, their confidence disappeared. My younger brother was the first to break. I didn't do anything. Dad told me what to do. My father immediately turned toward him. Don't lie. My uncle quickly jumped in. I only reviewed the paperwork. Within minutes, all 3 of them were blaming one another. The lead investigator listened without saying a word. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. Enough. The truth will come out in court. Later that night, Adnan called me again. This time, I could hear confidence in his voice. Ahmed, the chances of them getting away with this are very slim now. For the first time in days, I felt like I could finally breathe. But that feeling didn't last long. The next morning, another shocking discovery came to light. They hadn't just sold my house. Using my identity, they had also submitted applications for 2 massive loans in my name. If those loans had been approved, I would have been buried under millions of dollars in debt. I pushed my chair back and stood up. This wasn't just an attempt to steal my property. They were trying to destroy my entire life, my reputation, and my future. At that moment, I made myself a promise. I wasn't just going to get my house back. I was going to make sure every single person involved in this conspiracy answered for what they had done. The discovery that someone had applied for massive loans in my name erased the last bit of hesitation I had left. This was no longer just a property dispute. If I stayed quiet for even a few more days, I wouldn't just lose my beach house forever. I could end up drowning in debt for the rest of my life. That same day, I booked the first flight from Dubai back to Pakistan. During the entire flight, only one image kept replaying in my mind. My father, my younger brother, my uncle, the 3 of them sitting around a table, bargaining away my future. The moment I landed in Pakistan, I drove straight to my attorney Adnan Siddiqui's office. A stack of files was already waiting for me. Ahmed, he said, we finally have enough evidence. One by one, he laid everything out on the table. The forensic report, the bank surveillance footage, the property registry records, the buyer's sworn statement, and most importantly, the forged power of attorney that had been used to sell my house. I picked up the document. For a split second, even I thought the signature looked like mine. Whoever had forged it was incredibly skilled. But according to the forensic experts, there were tiny differences in every stroke, differences only trained specialists could detect. Adnan smiled. That's why science doesn't lie. The very next morning, we met with investigators from the anti-fraud unit. After reviewing the evidence, the lead investigator looked up and said, "This isn't an ordinary fraud case. We're looking at identity theft, forged government documents, financial fraud, and the illegal sale of real estate." That same evening, the court approved multiple search warrants. Police headed first to my parents' house. Neighbors gathered outside, peeking through windows and standing in their front yards, wondering what was happening. When my father opened the front door and saw the officers standing there, the color drained from his face. "What's going on?" he asked. The lead officer held up the warrant. "We're here to conduct a search of the property." Only minutes later, investigators discovered a locked file hidden inside a bedroom closet. When they opened it, they found photocopies of my property records, forged identification documents, bank paperwork, and several blank legal stamp papers. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. Tucked into the back of the file was a small notebook. Every page contained dates alongside handwritten payments. Registry office, bank, agent. Beside each entry was a large amount of money. It was obvious. Bribes had been paid to multiple people. Meanwhile, officers searched my younger brother's bedroom. His laptop was seized for examination. Forensic technicians quickly recovered digital files containing high-resolution scans of my genuine signatures. Those scans had been used to create the forged signatures found on every document. At that point, there was no room left for denial. Police also searched my uncle's office. There, investigators discovered a handwritten journal. Inside was the entire plan, step by step, the day they would visit the property registry, the day they would open the fraudulent bank account, the day they would hand my house over to the buyer. Everything had been carefully documented. By the end of the evening, all three of them had been formally arrested. As officers escorted them toward the police van, my father looked directly at me. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Son, we only wanted what was best for you." For the first time in my life, I looked him straight in the eyes and answered, "People who truly want what's best for someone don't steal everything they've worked for." He lowered his head and said nothing. The following day was our first court hearing. After reviewing the preliminary evidence, the judge addressed the courtroom. "Based on the evidence presented, this appears to be a coordinated criminal conspiracy. Criminal proceedings against all defendants will continue pending trial." The moment I heard those words, it felt as though a massive weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. But as we walked out of the courthouse, Adnan stopped me. "Ahmed, before you celebrate, there's something you need to know." I turned toward him. He lowered his voice. "We've just learned that your late grandfather left behind a secret shortly before he passed away." He paused. "And I have a strong feeling that's the real reason all of this happened." I froze. A secret will? If my grandfather had truly left one behind, what could possibly have been written in it that made my own family willing to destroy my entire life just to keep it hidden? Adnan's words stopped me in my tracks. "My grandfather's will?" I asked in disbelief. He nodded. "We don't have conclusive proof yet," he said, "but an elderly attorney contacted me this morning. According to him, your grandfather drafted a separate will just a few days before he passed away. A will that no one in your family has ever mentioned." 1,000 questions raced through my mind. If that will really existed, why had my father hidden it all these years? The next morning, Adnan and I drove to an old law office tucked away in the historic part of the city. A polished brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Nasser Hussain and Associates." Inside, an elderly attorney, well into his 70s, stood to greet us. He studied my face for a few moments before smiling. You look exactly like your grandfather." Without saying a word, I sat across from him. He reached into his desk drawer and carefully lifted out an old wooden chest. My grandfather's name was engraved across the lid. "I've kept this safe for 15 years, he said quietly. "Your grandfather instructed me that if there was ever fraud involving the family property, this chest was to be handed over to one person. Ahmed Khan." My hands began to tremble. The attorney slowly unlocked the chest. Inside were an old diary, property deeds, bank documents, and a sealed envelope. Written across the front, in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. "For Ahmed only." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten 4-page will. I began reading. "If after my death, any of my children allow greed to overcome them and treat Ahmed unjustly, or attempt to seize his property unlawfully, then every asset known only to my attorney shall legally become Ahmed's property." I turned the pages in disbelief. Attached to the will was a complete inventory of assets: agricultural land on the outskirts of Karachi, a commercial plaza in the city center, several industrial properties, investment certificates from multiple banks. I slowly looked at Adnan. He nodded. "Now I understand why they were in such a hurry to steal your house." "What do you mean?" He folded his arms. "If they buried you under lawsuits and financial problems, you probably never would have discovered this will." Just then, the elderly attorney placed another file on the desk. "This contains the record of my final meeting with your grandfather. He left something else for you. A voice recording." He pressed play. A moment later, my grandfather's calm but powerful voice filled the room. "Ahmed, if you're hearing this, then my greatest fear has come true. I learned long ago that wealth has the power to change people's hearts. If anyone ever wrongs you, don't fight for revenge. Fight for justice. And always remember, character is a far greater inheritance than property." Silence filled the room. My eyes began to water. For the first time, I realized my grandfather had understood me years before I ever understood myself. Adnan carefully gathered every document. Now comes the next step. The courtroom. A few days later, the will was officially presented before the court. My father, my mother, my younger brother, and my uncle were all present. As the judge read the most important sections aloud, I watched the color drain from my father's face. My younger brother jumped to his feet. "That will is fake." The judge immediately ordered a full forensic examination. 3 weeks later, the results were delivered. Every page, every signature, every seal, every drop of ink. Authentic. The judge closed the file and announced, "This court recognizes the will as legally valid and fully enforceable." The moment those words echoed through the courtroom, it felt as though years of weight had finally lifted from my shoulders. But the case wasn't over yet. The judge scheduled a final hearing. At that hearing, the court would decide not only the ownership of every disputed property, but also the criminal sentences for everyone involved in the forgery, identity theft, financial fraud, and conspiracy. As I walked out of the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set. I looked up at the sky and silently made a promise to my grandfather. I'll protect the legacy left behind, not just for myself, but for truth and justice. What I didn't know was that the final hearing wouldn't simply mark my victory. It would change the fate of my family forever. The day of the final hearing had finally arrived. An unusually large crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters, attorneys, curious onlookers, and people who had followed every twist of the case from the very beginning. This was no longer just a dispute over a beach house. It had become a high-profile case of forgery, family betrayal, identity theft, and financial fraud. I quietly walked into the courtroom beside my attorney, Adnan Siddiqui. Across the room sat my father, my mother, my younger brother, and my uncle. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I didn't see pride on their faces, only fear. When the judge entered, everyone in the courtroom rose to their feet. The case files were placed before him. He carefully reviewed every piece of evidence one last time: the forensic reports, the surveillance footage, the banking records, the property registry documents. my grandfather's will, and finally, my passport and immigration records, proving beyond any doubt that on the day my signature had supposedly been witnessed in Pakistan, I was thousands of miles away in Dubai. The judge looked toward my father. Do you have anything you wish to say before this court reaches its decision? Silence filled the courtroom. After several long moments, my father slowly stood up. His voice trembled. Your Honor, we made a terrible mistake. The room fell completely silent. The judge looked at him. A mistake? Or a carefully planned crime? My father lowered his eyes. Before he could answer, my younger brother suddenly stood up. Don't blame Dad. It was my idea. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. Through tears, he confessed. I always felt like Ahmed got everything. A successful business, respect, money, a beautiful home. I was always living in his shadow. I'm the one who convinced Dad that if we transferred the house into our names, everything would work out. My mother broke down in tears. Even my uncle lowered his head. Quietly, he admitted, I prepared the paperwork, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. The judge remained silent for several moments. Then he began reading the verdict. The evidence presented before this court proves beyond reasonable doubt that the plaintiff, Ahmed Khan, was the victim of forged signatures, identity theft, fraudulent property transfers, and an organized scheme to commit financial fraud. No one spoke. The courtroom was completely silent. Accordingly, this court orders that ownership of the beach house be immediately restored to Ahmed Khan. The purchaser shall receive a full refund, as he was also an innocent victim of this fraud. Furthermore, in accordance with the valid last will and testament of the late grandfather, every property and financial asset listed therein shall legally transfer to Ahmed Khan. I closed my eyes. After years of hard work, months of legal battles, and countless sleepless nights, justice had finally prevailed. But the judge wasn't finished. He continued reading. All defendants are hereby found guilty of forgery, financial fraud, preparing false legal documents, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. They are sentenced according to the applicable provisions of law. The courtroom remained silent. My father looked at me one last time. Tears filled his eyes. He wanted to say something, but no words came. As officers escorted him toward the exit, he quietly whispered, Son, if I could turn back time, I would never do any of this. I looked at him calmly. The anger inside me was gone, but trust, once broken, can never truly be restored. I answered softly, Some decisions change a person's entire life, Dad. You made yours. And today, we're living with the consequences. The officers led them away. One by one, the courtroom emptied. As Adnan and I stepped outside, the sunlight somehow seemed brighter than it had in months. He smiled and patted me on the shoulder. Congratulations, Ahmed. You didn't just win your house back. You won back your dignity. I took a deep breath. The legal battle was finally over. Or so I thought. Because life still had one more surprise waiting for me. A truth about my father. One I never could have imagined. Nearly 6 months had passed since the court's final verdict. Little by little, life was beginning to feel normal again. My beach house had been legally restored to me. My grandfather's estate had officially been transferred according to his will. My company was stronger than ever. I honestly believed that chapter of my life was finally over. But some stories don't end when the judge delivers the verdict. One morning, my assistant stepped into my office. Mr. Khan, she said, there's an elderly woman here asking to see you. She says she knew your father. I told her to send the woman in. A few moments later, a woman in her mid-60s slowly walked into my office carrying an old leather briefcase. She looked at me carefully before speaking. You really do look just like your grandfather. I invited her to sit down. She introduced herself. My name is Shazia. I worked as an accountant in your grandfather's office many years ago. She placed a thick file on my desk. This belongs to you. I looked at it confused. What's inside? She met my eyes. The truth about your father. My heartbeat quickened. I opened the file. Inside were old bank statements, receipts, photographs, and several handwritten letters. One of them immediately caught my attention. It was written in my father's handwriting. With trembling hands, I unfolded it and began to read. Ahmed, if this letter ever reaches you, I may no longer be alive, or I may no longer have the courage to face you. I've wronged you in more ways than I can count. But there's one truth I've never been able to tell anyone. I kept reading. When you started your company, you believed your first investment came from the bank. The truth is, the bank rejected your loan application. Without telling you, I mortgaged the only piece of land I owned so I could secure the money you needed. I couldn't bear to watch your dream die before it even had a chance to begin. I never wanted you to feel indebted to me, so I kept it a secret. My hands began to shake. I remembered those days perfectly. At first, the bank had rejected my application. Then, without explanation, everything suddenly changed. I had always believed it was luck. I never imagined my father had been the reason. But the letter wasn't finished. As the years passed, I made the greatest mistake of my life. I mistook your brother's weaknesses for someone who needed protecting. And I mistook your strength for someone who could endure anything. That was my greatest failure as a father. I stopped being fair. And one injustice eventually led me to commit another, until I crossed a line I should never have crossed. Tears blurred my vision. For the first time, my father wasn't just apologizing. He was telling the complete truth. Shazia quietly broke the silence. Your father gave me this file years ago. He told me that if he was ever unable to tell you the truth himself, I should give it to you when the time was right. I looked at her. Why? A gentle smile crossed her face. Because he knew that one day, you would discover the truth anyway. That evening, I drove alone to my beach house. I sat on the back porch, watching the waves roll onto the shore. Two different versions of my father filled my thoughts. The man who had tried to steal everything I had built, and the man who had once risked everything he owned to keep my dream alive. Both were real. Both were the same person. For the first time, I understood something I had never fully appreciated before. People are rarely completely good, or completely evil. Sometimes, one terrible decision is enough to erase a lifetime of good ones. I carefully folded my father's letter, placed it inside a new envelope, and stored it beside my grandfather's diary. I couldn't change the past, but I could decide that it would no longer control my future. Just then my phone rang. It was Adnan. His voice was filled with excitement. Ahmed, I have one more piece of good news. The court has ruled that every penny of the buyer's refund will be paid by the convicted defendants. You won't owe a single dollar. I smiled. For the first time in a long time, I realized that justice isn't found only in a courtroom. Sometimes, justice is finally learning the truth, even if it takes years. I ended the call, looked out across the ocean, and quietly whispered to myself, it's finally time to start living again. That night, I couldn't sleep. My father's letter kept replaying in my mind. One moment I felt anger, the next sorrow. Then, unexpectedly, compassion. Life has a strange way of reminding us that people are rarely just one thing. The same man who had once sacrificed everything to protect my dream had later tried to take that very dream away from me. The following morning, I arrived at my office as usual. Adnan was already waiting. The expression on his face told me something else had happened. Ahmed, he said, we've uncovered another issue. I sat down. What is it this time? He slid another file across my desk. While reviewing the properties transferred to you under your grandfather's will, we discovered that one of the commercial buildings was illegally transferred years ago. I looked up. Transferred to whom? He opened the file and pointed to a page. To a shell company. He paused. But the real owner of that company is your uncle. I couldn't help laughing. It wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. So they didn't just try to steal my house. They tried to steal Grandpa's estate too. Adnan nodded. Exactly. And that's probably why they were desperate to drag you into endless legal battles. They hoped you'd eventually give up before discovering everything. We immediately began investigating the company. Within days, the truth became clear. The business existed only on paper. There was no office, no employees, no legitimate business operations. It had been created for one purpose: to hide stolen property behind fraudulent documents. Adnan smiled. This time, we probably won't even need another trial. The evidence is so overwhelming that the Property Registry Authority can cancel the transfer administratively. 1 week later, that's exactly what happened. The illegal transfer was voided. Ownership of the commercial plaza was officially restored to me under my grandfather's will. A few days later, I visited the building for the first time. It was old, but solidly built. Small retail stores occupied the ground floor. Several offices filled the upper levels. Years of neglect had taken their toll. The property manager greeted me. "Sir, no one's invested in this building for years." I walked through every floor. Cracks ran across the walls. The elevator no longer worked. Water stains covered parts of the ceiling. Standing there, I made a decision. I'm not tearing this building down. The manager looked surprised. "Then what are we going to do?" I smiled. "We're going to bring it back to life." Over the next 3 months, the entire property underwent a complete renovation. A brand new elevator was installed. Every retail space was remodeled. The office floors were upgraded with modern facilities. When the building officially reopened, the tenants couldn't believe the transformation. Instead of raising their rent, I gave every business a 6-month rent discount so they could recover and grow. News spread quickly throughout the city. People began saying, "Ahmed isn't just a successful businessman. He's a man who believes in fairness." One evening, I stood on the rooftop of the renovated building, looking out over the city lights. Adnan walked over and stood beside me. "You know," he said with a smile, "if revenge had been your only goal, you'd probably still be fighting lawsuits." I kept my eyes on the skyline. My grandfather taught me something I'll never forget. Wealth isn't meant to give us power over people. It's meant to give us the ability to lift them up. Adnan nodded. Just then, my phone vibrated. A new message had arrived. It had been sent from prison. The sender was my younger brother. There was only one sentence. "Brother, if you can ever find it in your heart, please come visit me. There's something I need to tell you, something I don't think you know yet." I stared at the message for a long time. I knew that meeting wouldn't be easy. But deep down, I had a feeling. Maybe it was finally time to close the last unfinished chapter of my past. Several days passed after I received my brother's message from prison. Yet every morning I found myself reading it again. I was torn. On one hand was the brother who had played the biggest role in destroying my life. On the other was a man asking for one final chance to speak. Eventually, I decided to go. Before I left, Adnan gave me one piece of advice. "Ahmed, if you want to see him, you should. But remember, forgiveness and blind trust are two completely different things." I quietly nodded. The next morning, I drove to the prison. After waiting a few minutes in the visitor's room, my brother was escorted inside. The arrogant man I remembered was gone. His hair was unkempt. His face had grown thin, and the regret in his eyes was impossible to miss. He sat across from me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Brother, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." I looked at him calmly. "You said there was something important you needed to tell me." He took a deep breath. "There is. That's why I asked you to come." From his pocket, he carefully removed a small envelope that prison officials had allowed him to bring. "Dad gave this to me a few days before he died. He told me that if I ever truly realized what I'd done, I had to make sure this reached you." I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a short handwritten letter and a check. The amount wasn't life-changing, but the sentence written beneath it stopped me cold. "This is the last honest money I earned in my lifetime. Use it to help someone who's trying to rebuild their life. Maybe that's the only way I can begin to repay the mistakes I made." For several moments, I couldn't speak. Tears rolled down my brother's face. "Brother, I'm the one who pushed Dad down that path. If I hadn't been so greedy, maybe none of this would have happened." For the first time since all of this began, I looked into his eyes. I didn't see lies. I didn't see manipulation. I saw regret. Real regret. I spoke quietly. A person who makes terrible mistakes can become a terrible person, but someone who's willing to truly admit those mistakes can become a good person again. The choice is yours. He lowered his head and began to cry. I stood up, placed my hand gently on his shoulder. I can't give you back the past. But if you're serious about changing, then when you've served your sentence, you can still build a better future. As I walked out of the prison, my heart felt lighter than it had in years. A few weeks later, I took the money from my father's check, added several times that amount from my own savings, and established the Amanat Foundation. Its mission was simple: to help young people who had the talent to succeed, but lacked the financial means to continue their education or start a business. Within the first year alone, dozens of students received scholarships. Young entrepreneurs were given interest-free startup loans. Families who had nearly given up on their dreams finally had another chance. One evening, I sat on the porch of my beach house, watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the ocean. Lying beside me were three things: my grandfather's diary, my father's letter, and that small check. I realized those three items had taught me the greatest lessons of my life. My grandfather taught me the value of truth. My father taught me how one wrong decision can destroy everything a person has spent a lifetime building. And my brother proved that when someone sincerely accepts responsibility for their mistakes, the door to redemption is never completely closed. I looked out across the waves and smiled. In the end, I didn't just get my house back. I found something far more valuable: peace. That day, I finally understood that money, property, and success can make life comfortable. But real peace comes only through justice, truth, and the strength to forgive. I looked toward the sky and silently prayed, God, always give me the strength to stand for what's right, and the humility to make sure success never changes who I am. The waves continued rolling gently onto the shore. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon, and the most difficult chapter of my life finally came to an end. The end.